Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Carolyn. I think you all know me. But I decided to research Buddhism for my paper. So there was a lot to learn about it, and there's a lot of different sources that I found that didn't all agree with each other. So I'm going to say a lot of like, and one source said this, and another source said this, because there is a lot of that. So first of all, I want you guys all to think of like, what do you think of when you think of Buddhism? Because there are a lot of Buddhist symbols and ideas that have kind of infiltrated our culture, and so there's a lot of things like within your mindset that you might not realize, like, oh, that's from Buddhism, but there's like a lot of things from Buddhism that are very present in our culture. So like nirvana is an idea from Buddhism. This was actually the first thing I thought of when I was trying to think of an example for this. I was like, oh, Rafiki, he's meditating. The lotus symbology is very prominent because this is called the lotus position that he's sitting in, and so some of that. Karma, if you guys know that song by AJR, it's a concept of like, he's like, I've been really good, like why aren't good things happening to me? This is not exactly from Buddhism, but the idea of like yin and yang is present in one of the offshoots of Buddhism. And then we got like Buddha statues, and you probably haven't seen this before, but it's a pretty important symbol because it has to do with some of their like main doctrines. So yeah, so just keep thinking about that, and I think there's a little bit more as I talk more about it. They'll be like, oh, that's Buddhism, but also like the idea of Zen, karma, all those things come from Buddhism. So first I'm going to talk about the Buddha, the person who founded Buddhism, and that was Siddhartha Gautama. I'm not actually sure how it's supposed to be pronounced, but so he was born sometime around the 5th century BC. There was one source I found that said it was like 623 BC. There was another one I found that said like 480, and there was one that said like 550 exactly. So somewhere in that range of time, Siddhartha was born. He was born in northeastern India, in a region that is now Nepal, and he was born in India has the caste system, so their classes are determined based on like what family you're born into, and you can't really go, it's hard to go up classes, but you can go down classes basically. He was born into the second highest class, which is like nobility. His father was a king, and there are stories about how before Siddhartha was born, it was prophesied to his father that Siddhartha would either choose to stay in his life of luxury as a prince and then eventually a king and become a great king, but that if he chose not to stay in his life of luxury, that he would become a wandering ascetic and change the world. And so there's stories of that prophecy. There's multiple different accounts. There's one account of there were like 8 or 9 people who came to prophesy to his father and said, and like 8 of them said like, he's going to be a great king, and then the other one was like, he's going to be a wandering ascetic. And so his dad was like really stressed about that because he was like, my son has to stay and be a king. So yeah, so there was this prophecy, and there's multiple different accounts of that, and different ideas of how that went. And so then he was born sometime after that, like I said, we don't know exactly when, but around the 5th century BC. And then in his younger years, he did live in luxury. He was a prince, and he grew up in the palace and didn't really have any idea of like the outside world, because he didn't really leave and go experience what life was like outside of his parents' palace. In his later teen years, one source said he was 16, one source said he was 19. He was presented with a bunch of people that he could potentially marry, and he married his cousin. So that's a choice that he made. But yeah, he married his cousin, and then we don't really have a lot of information about what he did after that in the next like 10 years, but when he was 29 years old, one story said that he decided to go for like a ride in a carriage outside of the palace, and there was another story that said that he like snuck out on his own. So it's kind of unclear like how he did this, but they agree that he left the palace and he saw at least 3 different examples of suffering. One of them was someone who was very, very sick, one of them was someone who was very, very old, and then finally he saw a corpse. And he hadn't really been presented with the idea of like, people get sick, people get really old, people die. And so this just made it very clear to him that there's suffering everywhere in the world. It is ever present. And this was like really distressing to him because he was like, there's so much bad in the world, like I'm enjoying all these good things, but why does it matter if I'm going to die eventually, or if I could get sick, or if I will get old? So he was really troubled by the idea of like, there's so much suffering. Yeah. So then when he was 29, his son Rahula, which means hindrance, was born. And there was one story that said that he left the day his son was born. There was one story that said that he left like the week after his son was born. And then there was one story that said that he left like shortly after conceiving his son. So we don't know like how, he was not a good dad, that's basically it. But he was like, okay, a child, I'm out of here. And he left to live as a wandering ascetic. And it was pretty common at the time for there to be just wandering ascetics, people who would practice like self-denial. They would eat barely anything. They would like live out in the wild more or less and just like not have a place to stay, not have anything really to their name, but they would be meditating and seeking enlightenment. So that's what he was doing with these guys, and then eventually he lived like that from the time that he was 29 until he was 35. And when he was 35, he kind of had a realization of like, I've been all the way over here, I'm like, I had everything that I ever could have wanted, and I've been all the way over here as in like I had absolutely nothing, and I feel like there's something in between that. And so he realized that like not eating anything, first of all, was super not good for him, but also just that he wasn't finding satisfaction or enlightenment in the way that he was living. And so he was kind of shunned by the other guys that he had been hanging out with, the other like monks that he'd been with, because he started eating regular meals again and just like living like a regular person more or less, even though he was still kind of wandering with them. And so he then went and sat down under a tree and assumed the lotus position and sat there for about 6 weeks until eventually he had a vision, and that was his enlightenment. So that was like the big, like, oh, I get it now. And so what he realized was the Four Noble Truths, which are the basis of Buddhism. And then a few weeks later, he traveled somewhere else after getting this vision of becoming enlightened, and he went and he gave his first sermon, which was called The Wheel of the Doctrine. And so that's where that symbol comes in again, because it's important. He then spent the next 45 years of his life just telling other people about what he had discovered and what he had been enlightened with. And we call him the Buddha. Buddha just means like enlightened one. So he was just like, I get it, I understand the universe, because he meditated and he had this vision. Eventually, when he was 80, unfortunately he got dysentery and died of dysentery. Some people said he ate like poisonous mushrooms and that killed him. Some people said that he like ate some bad pork or something, but they agreed that he died. So yeah, so that's pretty much the timeline of his life. But during that time, after his enlightenment, but before he died, he founded a group of monks, and that group is called a Sangha, I think. I'm not sure how they pronounce it exactly, but it's spelled S-A-N-G-H-A. And he taught them all his doctrines, and they were his followers, but it wasn't super organized and it wasn't super like popular at the time while he was alive. And in fact, nothing about his life was written down for almost 400 years after he had died, which is why a lot of the stories don't quite line up with each other, because it was oral tradition that didn't spread exactly the same. There was even, in one of the books that I read, there were a lot of exaggerated stories about his life, including one that said that he was born being able to fully walk and talk, and like started prophesying the moment he like was born. So probably not accurate, but oral tradition, things can get stretched. So yeah, that's his life. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about like what Buddhists believe or what their like main doctrines are. The Four Noble Truths. Suffering is universal. So it's just the idea that like everywhere you look, there are bad things happening, and that, well, so he thought about it as dukkha, which is a bone twisted out of its joint. So he basically looked at the world and said, there is something really wrong in the world. There's a lot of suffering, people are in pain, bad things are happening, no matter what you do. And he kind of realized that like, even if you have all these good things, eventually they're going to go away, and you can't ever like stop suffering from happening. So yeah, and then the second one is suffering is caused by craving. Craving was also kind of called attachment. This idea is a little bit weird to explain, but tanha is attachment, and so the idea is that like because you want things, because you care about things, because you're like emotionally invested in things, they're able to hurt you. If you care about your friend and your friend leaves, that hurts you. And so because we have these cravings and just the desire to have things because we're attached to other people and animals and like other things in the world, that causes more suffering. So then the next one, logically, suffering will only cease when craving ceases. So nirodha is the idea of cessation, which is you just want to stop those cravings. So stop having desires for things. And then the fourth one is suffering can be eliminated by following the Noble Eightfold Path. So Marga is a word for the Noble Eightfold Path, which I will talk about more in just a second. But basically with these 4 truths, he presented his wheel of the doctrine, and he was like, look guys, everything in the world is bad, but here's how we can fix it. So yeah. So basically, this is the wheel with the Eightfold Path. I was gonna have it out as like a stepping stone path, but none of the like symbology that I could find with it kind of lined up with that. This is more how Buddhists think of it, is like it is a wheel. So you would start right here with right view. So you need to see the world for what it is. You need to see the suffering and believe those 4 noble truths in order to like start your path to enlightenment. And then right thinking, which would be agreeing with those. Right speech, right action, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Sorry. So basically, this is they want to not say unkind things about other people. They treat others well, and they don't commit any violence against anybody. They're not allowed to have any job that would cause harm to another living being. So like a fisherman or a soldier, or just anything that's going to, as part of your job, be taking a life or causing harm. And so by following all of these things, the idea is that they can stop those cravings and release themselves, free themselves from suffering, and also achieve enlightenment. Yeah. So that's the Noble Eightfold Path. Now we're going to do some vocabulary words. Yay! There's a couple other things. So samsara is the idea of the cycle of rebirths. They believe in reincarnation, and they see the world as circular rather than as linear. So we see, if we're Christians, and most people would see the world as like time started, there's a start point, there's going to be an end point, it's linear. They see it as a cycle. There was no discernible start to the world, but people are reborn over and over again, and there's a cycle of rebirths. Like I talked about earlier, Buddha is the enlightened one. So the main goal of Buddhism is to reach nirvana. So nirvana is an escape from samsara. Now, Buddhism and Hinduism came from the same root, which was Brahmanism, and there's a couple other words for that religion and those ideas that were in that area at that time. But they both have different ideas of nirvana, because in Hinduism, when you reach nirvana, you are done being reincarnated and you become part of the universal soul. And so the idea there is that I'm like a drop of water and I'm going to reach the ocean. So I get to be released from all the pain and suffering of the world and be at peace. And so there's that idea. Whereas in Buddhism, the idea of nirvana is that I'm like a candle and I'm getting extinguished. So instead of like, oh, I'm going on to something better, it is you are done. There's no more you don't exist anymore. It's over. And that's good for them because they are freed from the suffering. But until then, they believe that you're stuck in samsara and you just keep getting reborn and suffering more. With that, go back a second. There are 6 realms that they believe you can be reborn into. So the highest one is humans. Humans are the only ones with the ability to reach nirvana. Everybody else cannot. So like the devas and the demigods, there's kind of a line here of like, these ones are the good ones, these ones are the bad ones. You don't want to be an animal, a ghost, or in suffering. But with the devas and the demigods, there are really different ideas about this. Some Buddhists don't even believe in this actual idea, but the ones who do just kind of believe that the devas and demigods don't really get to do a lot and that they can't reach nirvana, so it's kind of a waste of time to become one of those. But they really want to be reborn as humans, and specifically if you're like a very traditional Buddhist, you want to be reborn as a man because women cannot reach nirvana. So, yeah. But yeah, they believe in reincarnation, and that is based on your karma. So it's a universal law that every deed, good or bad, is going to be rewarded or punished accordingly in this life or the next. There are lots of neutral things you can do, like sleeping and breathing, that it's like, that doesn't really get you karma either way. But like, if I'm like hitting people all the time, that's bad karma. If I'm like doing kind things for others, that's good karma. You guys understand. You know what good and bad are. So yeah, so in Hinduism, the karma is a little bit more focused on the next life, of like, I did good things and the next life will be good for me. Whereas from what I learned in in Buddhism, it's a bit more like, I did something good and something good is going to happen to me. Yeah, and then they don't want to do really bad things during this life because they might be reborn as like an animal, and that would be terrible because they don't want to be animals. Yeah, and then Dharma is just the name for all of Buddhist teachings collectively. Those have been written down in a group of writings called the Sutras, and there's at least 10 volumes of those. It's way bigger than the Bible, and most Buddhists have not read hardly any of it. But there's lots and lots of stories of the Buddha's life and times and like what he did and what his teachings were and what his sayings were. I actually read a pamphlet type thing. I guess you can't really call it a pamphlet. It was like 80 pages long, but that I got from the Purdue Buddhist Society, and it had a lot of stories about things that Buddha did while he was alive, and a lot of them did seem a little exaggerated, where it was like, and then he did this, and then he did this. They actually, about half of it was about Buddha's death, and it was kind of Shakespearean in that they were like, and then he did this, and then he did this, and it was all like the last day that he was alive, and there were a lot of things. So yeah, but they hold to those teachings, and then there's certain things that are considered sutras by some and not by others, and that aren't a part of like the main writings, so there's lots of extra stuff. Yeah, and then I'm not even going to try to pronounce that next one, but that's their other word for the Four Noble Truths. And then I already talked about Asanga, so yeah, so okay. Alright, there are 3 major main groups of Buddhists nowadays. There's the Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. So Theravada would be considered like the fundamentalists. They're the ones who are like, these are the sutras and we're holding to them, and they're very traditional in that they will hold to what Buddha says, and they do not worship the Buddha, and they are kind of the ones I've been talking about already, of like their goal is to reach nirvana so they can cease to exist. And like I said, you have to be a man, and you have to be in a sangha. You have to be a monk. If you're just a man and you become enlightened on your own, but you're not living as a monk, you will not reach nirvana, but maybe in the next life. You would have good karma for the next life to be able to maybe become a man who becomes a monk. The other thing that really differs in terms of Hinduism and Buddhism is that Buddhists do not believe that you have a soul. Instead, you are made up of karmic matter, and it kind of gets rearranged. So the next life me is not the same me as I am. So when I'm reborn, my karmic matter gets like all mixed up and put into a new life, but that's not really the same person. Whereas like the Hindu idea of reincarnation is a little bit more like, this is my soul, and my soul when I die is going to go into another body and have another life. So it's a little bit different. So yeah, and then the Mahayana is the biggest group because they have the most littler subgroups from them. Their ideas are a lot more looser. They're a lot less likely to have read the sutras and to like know all the things that Buddhists are supposed to believe. They're also way more likely to be worshiping Buddha. There are lots of people who do worship the Buddha, and that's why there's like the little statues of him. And yeah, there's also some of them that like pray to the Buddha, not just to save them like from samsara, but also to save them just like in everyday situations. The same way that we might be like, oh, God help me with whatever, they might pray to Buddha. And then their goal is also not just to reach nirvana, they want to become enlightened so that they can help other people become enlightened. So they're not like, oh, I'm trying to get extinguished, I want to help other people see the light, more or less. Yeah, and then there's the Vajrayana. They're a little weird. When Buddhism came into Tibet, Buddhism just kind of mixed together with what was already going on in Tibet, which was a lot of like witchcraft, nature worship, and just some other interesting ideas, but shamanism was what that was called. And so this Vajrayana is also called Tantrism. There's still a lot of like meditation and yoga involved in that and like seeking enlightenment, but they are very different than the other Buddhist groups because they believe that everybody has the male and female energies within them, and the way to like release those is through sexual practices. They also have a bigger emphasis on following your impulses, so where a Buddhist would be like, I want to do this, but I'm not going to because that like doesn't seem like a good idea. They're like, oh, I feel like doing this, I should. And that way they don't have the impulse anymore. So yeah, a little bit different, and kind of like I would put Theravada and Mahayana in one category and Vajrayana in a completely different one. But it still is an offshoot of Buddhism because it was formed when Buddhism went to Tibet. So yeah, and then I've got a thing showing how many of each, or the percentages. So this is a map showing how Buddhism spread. The early on followers of Buddha were mostly just like wandering monks, and so a lot of them used the Silk Road to go into China and just traveled all around and were just sharing with individual people about the enlightenment that the Buddha had achieved. And so, I don't know how well you guys can see those arrows, but basically it just kind of spread. And then in the 3rd century, the emperor of India was like, Buddhism is the religion now, so everybody follow that. So that really helps the spread within India. So it kept going. And then this next map is showing, so Buddhism isn't just the Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, because each of those has had offshoots, because with Buddhism, it's been really easy for people to say, well, my dad believed this, and my mom believed this, and you just presented me with Buddhism, so we're just gonna mix all of that together, and I'll be a Buddhist now, but I'm gonna keep some of these other ideas. So that's where like the worshiping of Buddha came in, and just some of the other practices is that they wouldn't say like, I'm gonna get rid of whatever I believed before, because Buddhism doesn't really demand that. It's just kind of like, okay, these things all kind of go together, let me just mix them. So there's, this is just showing like different ideas and where they are prominent, because there's a lot of different ones. Yeah, and then I've also got a world distribution map. So Buddhism is mostly heavily concentrated, obviously over here, but there are Buddhists present throughout. So yeah, and within the US there are between 4 and 5 million Buddhists today. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Buddhism versus Christianity. We all agree that there is a lot of suffering in the world. We just really disagree about the cause of that suffering. And then Buddhism and Christianity also have a lot of overlap in the way that they think that a person should act, because Buddhists are not supposed to harm other people. They're not supposed to be like slandering other people or like speaking poorly about them. And they're just generally supposed to be kind and like well-mannered. But the difference is the reason for that. Because Buddhists are worrying about karma and working on trying to like be the best them that they can be. And actually, I interviewed one of the members who was actually like in charge right now of the Purdue Buddhist Society, and he talked about. He told me you can think of Buddhism as like the world's best self-help program, and so it's just this idea that like you can improve yourself through all of this hard work and through just like learning to be a better person. So yeah, but then we disagree on a lot of major points, like. We believe that there is a big G God, and we believe that salvation, they would say that salvation, if you're in the Mahayana, then you can get salvation from Buddha, and you can pray to him and become enlightened and get to achieve nirvana, or you can find it within yourself. You can be good enough and make it, whereas we have, the Bible tells us that salvation is found in no one else other than Jesus, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. So we believe in one Savior who can take away our sins, whereas they are looking just to find it within themselves to be saved. And their salvation looks a lot different than ours. Our eternity, what we believe about that is that like God began the world, Genesis 1:1, and then we know that Jesus is coming back. Whereas they believe that, like I talked about earlier, time is not linear. There's no eternity, it's a circle. And then our purpose, we believe that like God made us in his image, and with that we have a purpose, which is to glorify him in what we're doing. And we believe that we are God's workmanship and created in Christ for good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Whereas they would say that your purpose is whatever you have found to be your purpose. Obviously, I couldn't be a Buddhist and be like, my purpose is to kill people. But you could, I mean, whatever you believe that your purpose is in the world, you could say, oh, my purpose is just to like have a good time, or my purpose is to whatever. And like Buddhism kind of agrees with whatever you agree with. Whereas within Christianity, we believe that God has a specific purpose and a general purpose for all of his believers, or all of his followers. So yeah. And then a couple of the problems that I thought of with Buddhism, one of them would be exclusivity, because if you're a Theravada Buddhist, then about half of us in this room could never reach nirvana in our lives. And actually most of us, because none of you are Buddhist monks, right? So none of us will be on the path to nirvana right now. So it's a little bit exclusive, and then my other problem is just inconsistency. I'm a very I like to know what the rules are. I like to know what the structure is of things, and so I think it doesn't really make sense to me how you can look at that religion and see all of the different inconsistencies with it and all the different groups that have broken off from it. And I kind of see it as a salad bar of beliefs, because you can be like, well, I believe this, but I don't believe this, and I do believe this, but I don't believe this. So you can kind of pick and choose what it is that you want to believe about Buddhism, whereas with Christianity, there are certain very solid doctrines that if you don't believe those, you're not a Christian. So yeah, so those are the problems. And then I think that Buddhism can be really appealing to people because you can make your own rules if you want. Like I said, it could be a salad bar. And also, there's the idea that you can be good enough. You can help yourself enough to the point that you have achieved nirvana on your own. And for lots of people out there who do want to be good enough, that's really nice. It's oh yeah, I did it. I'm enlightened. I'm doing great. And then also you could be a legalistic perfectionist, which is what I would probably be if I were Buddhist. Because if you wanted to, you could read all the sutras and follow all the sutras and be I'm exactly perfect and I'm doing everything that Buddha wants me to. And so that could be really appealing of you have not only the I helped myself to this, but also I am better than others. And then it also, and thinking about this, it makes me very sad that Buddhists, their whole purpose in their life, what they're trying to do is escape the cycle of suffering. And someone who is a Buddhist and doesn't hear about Jesus and doesn't accept Christ as their savior is going to die thinking, oh, I'm going to escape this cycle of suffering, only to spend eternity in suffering. So that was really difficult for me to think about. So yeah, I really enjoyed learning about Buddhism just because on Beach Reach this year, one of the only people that I encountered that I wasn't able to share the gospel with was somebody who said that they were Buddhist, and I had no idea what to say to them. So that kind of sparked my interest in this to say okay, what do Buddhists believe? And a couple things about evangelism with Buddhists. Do not ask them if they want to be born again. No, they do not. And then also, if you talk about eternal life, that's not it. They don't want eternal life. They want to escape. But it's kind of if you talk to someone and they say that they're already a Christian, just kind of ask them what does that mean to you? Because you could meet a Mahayana Buddhist who believes whatever it is that they want, and then you could also meet a Theravada Buddhist who's I'm following everything exactly. So there's a lot of different categories underneath that, and so you really have to just talk to them one-on-one to find out what they individually believe. And that's something I even observed within the Purdue Buddhist Society's Discord chat, is that they would all kind of ask each other, that was one of my sources, they all kind of were asking each other well, what do you think about this? Oh, you think that? I disagree, but I think this. And they all just kind of share their ideas about things, and so it's not very unified. So if I were to evangelize to a Buddhist, I would want to do it one-on-one and just hear what they think and what they believe about the world. And I would really connect with them on the idea of suffering, because that's the one really big thing that we agree with. And I would ask them why do you think that this suffering exists? Because that wasn't something I could find anywhere of what do they think is the cause of that. So yeah, thank you guys. That's all I had. Any questions?
So who's Buddha?
Well, Siddhartha was the first Buddha, and then there have been other Buddhas since then, but basically anybody who's enlightened is a Buddha, but the one that they look back to as the first one was Siddhartha. Yes?
Do they mention anything about Jesus in there, if he was enlightened, or how do they view him?
One of the sources that I read talked about the idea that some Buddhists have said, oh yeah, Jesus was definitely enlightened, and then that kind of creates some cognitive dissonance, because if Jesus was enlightened, then he would be speaking truth, and Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. So everything that Jesus said, if he was enlightened and he was speaking the truth, then everything he said was true, and he is the Son of God, which means that Buddhism is not true. So that's kind of an issue there that I think was not really elaborated on by the Buddha. They were just kind of oh yeah, he was enlightened, that's it. So, yeah.
So they don't really have a
view or an explanation for why suffering began? Do they have any sort of view on, they view time as a circle, on where the world like comes from, or did it just always exist?
That was something that I asked Sawyer, the guy that I was talking to who was a Buddhist, about, and he said that what he personally believes is that like the karmic matter that people are made up of has always existed, and like there hasn't been anything new created, but like over time, more or less he believes in like evolution, but that the karmic matter didn't come from anywhere and isn't going anywhere. And so eventually, the way he said it really confused me. But basically, eventually there was like life forms, like carbon-based organisms, that were then collided with the like karmic matter, and that eventually became people. And so it was like a blend of the Buddhist idea of karmic matter with evolution. But I think if you asked a different Buddhist, they might give you a different answer. Yes?
So building off of that, and since your goal is to achieve nirvana or not being alive, the karmic matter would be destroyed, right? But the population of Buddhism in the entire world is increasing. What are their views on that? You just said they can't make more karmic matter, but there has to be more.
I think they would just see it as like, that's another person who died, that there's more karmic, like that karmic matter comes back. So whoever it was that died most recently just came back as this other being, like their karmic matter got rearranged, but they must not have been enlightened. That's why.
When they come back after reincarnation, do they have memory of their past life?
No.
Can they explain that?
I think it's part of the whole idea of the karmic matter getting rearranged, of it's like, they're just a different thing now, even though it's the same parts, I guess, for lack of a better word, because it's a very abstract concept. So, yeah. And I think that in Tantrism, or the Vajrayana, I think that they have a concept of like sometimes you can remember things, but theirs is very different because they have like the witchcraft element to it, so you can like talk to spirits and things. So it's different. Yes.
How do they view other religions? How do they explain like the beginning of Christianity versus some other religion?
Well, some would say that Jesus was enlightened, like we talked about, and some would just say that like, well, they're wrong, but like that's not my business. It's a very peaceful and like like they just wouldn't want to talk about it, from what I could tell. Yeah.
Has anyone tried to use Buddhism as a way to like create warring setups? I know like most religions have ways you can manipulate them to kind of get people to go to war. Does Buddhist have any of that in its history?
No, not really. At least the pamphlet that I read that was very long, it talked about like Buddhism is the only religion that's never like gone to war for its religion. We've never forced anybody to adopt this. We've never made anybody do this, which is not exactly true, because I did talk about that emperor who was like, this is our religion now, but that wasn't really a fight. It was just kind of like, you believe this. And since Buddhism is very peaceful and very much about like, we'll kind of coexist, there was a lot of like, oh, well, I can still believe this and believe that. So they just kind of mixed it together. So it's pretty easy to adopt and be like, oh, I'm a Buddhist now, and still keep whatever your other religion was, unless your religion straight up says Buddhism is wrong. So they've never like forced anybody like physically. Yes?
When you interviewed a Buddhist, was, like, I'm sure you approached it like informationally, but was there like any sort of like him trying to like evangelize you? Like, did he have any interest in trying to get you to believe what he believes?
Well, so I did it over Discord, so we didn't like actually speak to each other. I just like sent him questions and he sent me answers because there wasn't a time in our schedules that lined up. It wasn't quite like he was trying to evangelize to me. It was more of a, like, you don't understand, let me help you understand. And he did help me understand a lot about what he believes, but there was not really a ton of like persuasion for me in that. Someone else who didn't have Christianity and was seeking may have been persuaded or felt like, oh, this makes sense. But I didn't really feel like he was pushy or anything like that. Yeah.
So you talked about it at the end of the evangelism with touching on suffering. Are there any other like big questions you can think of, like to break down the faith a little more? Suffering.
I mean, if it's somebody who knows like the history of Buddhism, I would ask them like why Buddhism instead of like Hinduism, or why Buddhism instead of like, if they're like Mahayana or Theravada, then I'd be like, why not this one that mixed with all these other ones, just to see if they have a reason for that. Because I mean, similarly, if someone wanted to ask me why I believe what I believe, they could be like, well, like Christianity was an offshoot of Judaism, why don't you just believe Judaism? Or like looking at other Abrahamic religions, they'd be like, why don't you follow Islam? I could explain that to them, and I don't know if they would be able to, but that also would be going at it from a very intellectual point of view. I also think that it could be, if you don't want to go intellectual, if you want to go more emotional, which could be difficult with them because they're supposed to like not have cravings anymore. I would talk about like the concept of a soul and what they actually think about that, because I think that a lot of them would say, yeah, I do have a soul, and then going off of that, like, okay, so what's going to happen to your soul when you die? And that's what I think.
Also, which ones does Chris have?
I don't know. I found so many things that were like, this celebrity is a Buddhist, and this celebrity is a Buddhist, and this celebrity is a Buddhist. And you can kind of say you're a Buddhist and then believe whatever you want. So, I don't know. But probably he would fall under the Mahayana because they're the most like loose ones of like, oh yeah, sure. Most Buddhists in the U.S. of non-Asian descent are Mahayana because it's very whatever you want. Yes?
Where do they say cravings come from? And then do they have an understanding of sin? What is it if they do?
So the craving comes from just like your own attachment to things. So because like when you're born into the world, you have feelings. The craving just kind of comes from that. And so part of escaping suffering is getting rid of those cravings. So it's just something you're born with, I guess. And then what was your other question?
Do they have an understanding or concept of sin?
Not in the same way that Christians would, because Christians see sin as like, God defines what's right and wrong, right? Sin is anything you think, say, or do that goes against God's word or goes against God's character. And since they don't believe in a big G God, and the little G gods do not define morality, they don't really have a standard for morality other than that they know what's right and wrong. And the Bible has an explanation for that. God's law is written on our hearts. But they don't really have an explanation for why something is right or wrong. It's just we know what's good and bad, and the universal law of karma is going to pay us back for whatever we do. Yeah.
If Buddhists, they believe you're not supposed to have attachment, how do they view families and like having kids?
From what I could tell, it's kind of up to them. In like the it wasn't a pamphlet, I couldn't think of a good word to call this, but in the pamphlet thing that I got from the Fruity Buddhist Society, there was a story in there of somebody that Buddha said was like most enlightened, and it was this man who went out to meditate and sat under a tree for like a while, and at one point his wife brought their like young child out to see him, and he ignored the child and just kept meditating, and then eventually they left. And Buddha was like, that guy's doing great. So I found that story really sad. But that's kind of, it goes with the idea of like, well, if that man's child had died, he wouldn't have suffered because he didn't care about it. He didn't have that attachment anymore, and so that's how, like, part of the enlightenment for him. I think that within, like, Western Buddhism, like in the US, it's a little bit different. You, like, obviously a lot of, like, the celebrities, like, I'm not sure if this is true anymore, but it said that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie are Buddhists, and they've got a bunch of kids, and they've like adopted most of them. So obviously they're not against that. So I think it kind of varies on like the region and the group.
Do you know if the Force from Star Wars was adopted from Buddhism?
I do not.
Can you tell me why the images are different? There's a fat Buddha and a skinny Buddha. Was it after he got out of the like wandering and he decided to eat again, or is it a different Buddha?
It could be a different Buddha. I honestly do not know. I did not look into his weight or body type. I imagined that he would be pretty thin because he didn't eat like anything. And actually, one of the sources that I read said that while he was living as an ascetic, he would eat like 1 grain of rice a day. So, I don't know. I would imagine he'd be really thin. Any other questions? Yes.
Great job.